大家好啊，今天是2025年的8月22号。我看到了关于米尔斯海默非常好的一个在中国大学演讲的视频啊，那是咱们大学同学朋友冒死偷拍下来的，全长1个多小时。可能这个视频会比较长，但是呢，我认为有必要看一看，因为对他整套这种，尤其是米老头的这种进攻型现实主义的理论，它是以现实主义为基础的。那大家要知道，我们国内的大多数人都是现实主义者，就是从古至今啊，一直都在说有没有用，是不是足够的现实。其实中国人没有那么绝对的迷信，他上层的智者一直都是信奉现实主义，把现实看得非常的残酷。那也是根据这1个小时24分钟的视频呢，我们也一起来看一下米尔斯海默他究竟对于这一套的理论贯彻的话会有多深。好，我们现在就开始看啊，话不多说。
Europe really mattered. Why? Yes, Nazi Germany was very powerful. And then when the Cold War comes, we cared much more about Europe than we cared about Asia. Even though we cared about Asia, it just didn't matter that much. Why did we care about Europe more than Asia? Because the heart and soul of the Soviet military was located in Central Europe. It wasn't located in East Asia. We cared about East Asia, but not that much. We cared a great deal about Europe. Europe was the #1 area in the world. Today, for the first time in our history, the most important area in the world to us is East Asia. Just want to understand that. We care, from a strategic point of view, much more about East Asia than we do about Europe. Why is that the case? Because China is in East Asia, Russia is in Europe. Russia is a weak great power. It's not a threat to dominate Europe. It's not the Soviet Union. China is a peer competitor. It's in East Asia, and we worry that China is going to become a regional hegemon. So what I'm telling you is that East Asia is the area of the world that really matters the most to us, and the China threat is the most important threat we face, simply because China is big, and if you're big, you're going to attract the attention of the United States. Okay, it's very important to understand that. So East Asia is the most important area of the world. I would argue the Gulf is the second most important area of the world, and I would argue that for us, Europe is the So that's the basic laydown. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, if you cold-hearted, hard-nosed strategists in the audience who are in charge of American foreign policy, how do you think about organizing your grand strategy? What you want to do is, number one, you want to pivot to Asia. You want to fully pivot to Asia and concentrate on containing China, number one. Number two, if you pivot somewhere, you have to pivot away from some other place. Where do you want to pivot away from? Europe, right? The United States should have hardly any forces in Europe. There's no threat to dominate Europe, right? And furthermore, as far as the Middle East or the Persian Gulf is concerned, what you should want there is peace, stability. Why is that the case? You want stability in the Middle East or the Persian Gulf so you can pivot to East Asia. And you want to get out of Europe, if you can, so you can pivot to East Asia. You see? Furthermore, there's the question of the Russians. How do you think about the Russians? You're all good strategists. This is obvious. If you're the United States and you're competing with China, you want the Russians on your side. You want it to be the United States plus Russia against China. If you're Chinese, you want the Chinese and the Russians together against the Americans. But that's not what we want. Now, that's the ideal situation. If I was in charge, that's what it would look like. But as you know, I'm not in charge. People in China listen to me more than people in the United States. I have more in common intellectually with you than I do with my fellow countrymen. That's not where we're at. So where are we at? Number one, we are pinned down in Eastern Europe in a war against Ukraine, which makes it difficult to pivot to Asia. Furthermore, we're now pinned down in a war, actually a series of wars, in the Middle East, which makes it difficult to pivot to Asia. This is not good. And furthermore, because of our foolish policies involving the Ukraine war, we pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is a gross violation of balance of power politics 101. That's where we are. You understand that? I mean, the United States is pinned down in major conflicts in the Middle East / Persian Gulf and in Europe / Ukraine. And that makes it very difficult for us to pivot. You've surely seen some of those pictures of all the naval and air assets that we have in the Middle East to help Israel. It's really quite remarkable, the assets that we have in the Middle East. Those assets should be in East Asia if you're interested in containing China. But they're not in East Asia. And furthermore, you have all sorts of problems in Ukraine that have kept the United States, again, not only from pivoting, fully pivoting, but furthermore, has driven policy there, has driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So what I want to do now is I want to unpack this story for you and lay out in detail what is going on. And I want to start first with China. And I want to talk about why the United States should care about containing China and make an argument that I'm sure is controversial to some people in the audience. My view about international politics says that the international system is a really dangerous environment. It's a place where countries' survival can be put at risk. As all the Chinese in the audience know, you once suffered a century of national humiliation. If you're weak in the international system, you stand a really good chance of suffering a century of national humiliation. Let me give you just another example, and I'll talk more about this. You all know that the Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion from the beginning. President Bill Clinton decided in 1994 that we were going to expand NATO eastward. The Russians screamed bloody murder at the time. They made it clear that they were opposed to NATO expansion. In 1999, we shoved the first wave of expansion down their throat. In 2004, we shoved the second wave of expansion down their throat. And then in 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, we told them, despite the fact they made it clear that it was unacceptable to them, that we were going to shove the third big wave down their throat, which was to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. You want to ask yourself why we were doing this? We were doing it because Russia was weak. Russia was weak. You do not want to be weak when you're dealing with the United States. You understand that, right? You do not want to be weak. The United States is a ruthless great power. But all great powers are ruthless. Just want to keep that in mind. The United States is not an exception. You surely know that. Soviet Union, Imperial Germany, and Imperial Japan. You know about Imperial Japan. You know what happened in 1931, and you especially know what happened in 1937. You were weak and you were easy prey for the Japanese, although in the end not so easy. But the point is, you don't want to be weak. You want to be powerful. If you're Chinese, you want to be 10 times more powerful than Japan. You do not want to be in a situation where Japan is 10 times more powerful than you. You understand that basic logic. And the reason is, right, the reason is a simple theory that I have, which is that when you live in a world where there's no higher authority, it can save you if you get into trouble. There's no night watchman in the international system. No higher authority. The United Nations? Come on. Serious? If you get into trouble in the international system, who are you going to call? The answer is nobody. So it's a self-help system. Furthermore, the problem that you run into is you can't know the intentions of other states. Certainly future intentions. Can you tell me who's going to be the president of the United States with certainty after the November election? I think you can, because I can't. And can you tell me who's going to be running China in 10 years, 20 years? You cannot. Can you tell me what that person's intentions are going to be? No, you can't. Not because you don't know who the person will be, but the fact is the circumstances in which that person will operate will be different than the circumstances that exist today. And it's hard to figure out what that person who is in charge of China or the United States, pick your country, will be thinking about in terms of aggression against you. And the problem that you face in the system is that sometimes states with malign intentions, with bad intentions, are really powerful. They're really powerful. If you're Chinese and you're looking at the United States today, the United States is an incredibly powerful country, right? And you can never be completely certain what its intentions are. They look malign, but how malign are they? And if you get in trouble with the United States, you can't call 911. There's nobody at the other end. So what does this tell you? What this tells you is you want to be a regional hegemon in my story. You want to dominate your area of the world. You want to dominate East Asia the way we, the United States, dominates the Western Hemisphere. You understand that no country in the Western Hemisphere would dare to attack the United States. The ideal situation for China would be where it was so powerful in East Asia that no country in the area would dare to attack China. You want to be much more powerful than Japan. You want to be much more powerful than Russia. You want to be much more powerful than India. And very important, you want to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, then you want to push them out beyond the second island chain. You do not want the Americans in your backyard. Whether you can do that's another matter. I'm not talking about the feasibility. I'm just saying, from China's point of view, you want to dominate East Asia. Now, a lot of Chinese, when I say this, think that I'm saying China's a highly aggressive, offensively oriented country. It's not my argument. My argument is that the best way to survive in the international system is to be a regional hegemon, which is very simple. You want to dominate your region of the world so that you can go to bed at night and not have to worry about somebody in the neighborhood attacking you. Do you think I worry about Canada or Mexico attacking me? Or Guatemala or Honduras? Come on. We are incredibly powerful in the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't get any better than that. Furthermore, you want to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. Right? In other words, the United States does not want China to be a regional hegemon. As I like to say, there were 4 countries in the 20th century, 4 countries that were capable of pursuing regional hegemony and were moving in that direction. And we stopped all 4 of them. Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States does not tolerate their competitors. So what I'm saying here is that the United States, what I'm saying is that China should attempt to become a regional hegemon. That's the ideal situation for you. But you should understand the Americans will do everything they can to prevent it. Right. I want to make one other point for you folks just to think about. Why does the United States care whether China is a regional hegemon. After all, we have this giant body of water called the Pacific Ocean that separates us from China. Who cares, from an American point of view, whether China dominates Asia? Here's the reason. If China dominates, let me come at it from a different angle. Most of you have probably never asked yourself why the United States is roaming all over the world, sticking its nose in everybody's business. You know that the United States does that, right? It roams all over the world. We have bases here, there, and everywhere. We think we have the right, the responsibility, and the power to influence the domestic politics of every country. We want to turn China into a liberal democracy. We want color revolutions in Russia. We're everywhere. Why are we everywhere? Because we're a regional hegemon. We have no threats in our backyard, and we are therefore free to roam. If we had two other great powers in the Western Hemisphere that we had to pay attention to, we would not be free to roam into your backyard. You follow the logic? And what we don't want is for you to be free to roam. In other words, if you have no threats in East Asia, you're free to roam the way we now roam all over the planet. That's the reason that at a purely theoretical level, in international anarchy, you should, number one, want to be a regional hegemon, and number two, you should make sure there is no other regional hegemon. So, if you go to the present relationship between the United States and China, what's driving it is the fact that China has become an incredibly wealthy country. It has a huge population, and therefore it can generate a formidable military capability. And furthermore, it doesn't have many real rivals in East Asia. Maybe the Japanese. They're not really. So the United States is really worried that you're going to take that military capability and turn yourself into a regional hegemon. And by the way, you know that China believes, or most Chinese believe, certainly the elites believe, they should take back Taiwan. They should dominate the East China Sea. And they should dominate the South China Sea and dominating the East China Sea and taking back Taiwan. And you look at the size of the Chinese economy and the growing size of the Chinese military. You look like a regional hegemon for the United States. And again, deep down inside, most American strategists understand it makes sense for you to be a regional hegemon. And if it makes sense for you to be a regional hegemon, you've got all that power, and you're kind of moving in that direction, you're going to draw the attention of the United States. And that's what's going on today. It's not because China, I want to, again, be clear, this is not because China's aggressive. It's actually not because the Americans are aggressive. When you come to China, and most people, if you ask them what's the cause of the growing conflict between the United States and China, most Chinese people blame the United States. Most Americans blame the Chinese. That's not my argument. My argument is it's the structure of the system. This is the tragedy of great power politics. You've all read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, right? Hobbes' Leviathan is like states in anarchy. There's no higher authority. There's no Leviathan in the state of nature. The reason you create a Leviathan in Hobbes' story is so you can ameliorate this problem. If we had a world state, you wouldn't have the problem. But we don't have a world state. We live in international anarchy. So, basically, what is going on here is you have this competition. And from an American point of view, China is the principal threat in the system. It's this logic that explains it. It's why the Pentagon refers to China as the pacing the pacing threat. China really matters to the United States. Okay, the point I made to you, and now I want to unpack this more, is that we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine if you believe that we should be containing China. And furthermore, we shouldn't be involved in these wars in the Middle East if you believe in containing China. Let's go to Ukraine. Again, you want to always remember with Ukraine, it's not only that we're pinned down in Ukraine, it's also that we've driven the Russians into your arms. This is manna from heaven for you. Right? The fact that we've driven the Russians into your arms. And it's remarkably foolish on our part. Let's talk about Ukraine. It really goes back to NATO expansion. As I told you before, in 2004, Bill Clinton said, we're going to expand NATO eastward. We're just going to push and push and push. And we got away with it in 1999. That's when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in. We got away with it in 2004. That's when the Baltic states, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria came into NATO. Then 2008, April 2008, we said that Ukraine, Georgia are going to come into NATO. April 2008. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August of 2008, you had a war between Georgia and Russia over this very issue. Then the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out in 2014. So the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO is 2008. The crisis breaks out in February 2014, and the war breaks out, the big shooting war, which is still going on, in February 2022. Now, if you come to the West and you ask people who caused the Ukraine war, they blame Vladimir Putin. Okay? And they argue that Putin is an imperialist, he's bent, determined to build a greater Russia. What he wanted to do was he wanted to conquer Ukraine, all of Ukraine, and incorporate it into Russia, make it part of a greater Russia. Then he was going to conquer other countries. He was going to rebuild the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. This is the story that you hear, all designed to make Vladimir Putin look like the bad guy for causing this war. There is not a shred of evidence to support that argument. I like to say there is zero evidence that Putin had any interest in conquering Ukraine. There's zero evidence that he was interested in creating a greater Russia. And in fact, Putin went to great lengths to avoid a war. The war that broke out February 24th, 2022, Putin tried to avoid it. And by the way, when the war started, he immediately, this is Putin, immediately reached out to the Ukrainians and said, let's have negotiations and see if we can end this war. And the negotiations in Istanbul were making excellent progress towards resolving the war. And along comes the British, Boris Johnson, and the Americans. And we tell Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations. Doesn't sound to me like Putin was much of an imperialist, right? It was the United States. He still thought the Russians were weak. Remember the century of national humiliation? These are the 2 decades of national humiliation for the Russians, right? 1990s, early 2000s. We're shoving things down their throat. Of course, it all proved to be wrong. The Russians are going to win in Ukraine. I'll talk about that in a second. But it is very important that you understand that the United States is principally responsible for this disaster. And when the war broke out and it looked like we might get a settlement, I'm not saying it would have happened at Istanbul, we might have gotten a settlement. The United States moved in and prevented those negotiations from being completed. So we're in this war. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, what's going to happen in the war? Well, what's going to happen is the Russians are going to win. They're going to win an ugly victory. And you're probably asking yourself, why do I say that? This is an old-fashioned war of attrition. This is like World War I on the Western Front. This is two powerful armies standing toe-to-toe and trying to bleed the other side white before they are bled white. That's what's going on here. This is attrition warfare. And what determines who wins a war of attrition? This is the question you want to ask yourself. Anytime you see two armies pounding each other, the question is, who wins? And what really matters are two things. Number one, the balance of artillery. Who has the most artillery? Why is that the case? Because artillery causes about 80% of the casualties on the battlefield. The Ukrainians have said explicitly on a number of occasions that 80+% of the casualties in the war between Ukraine and Russia are caused by artillery. It's usually infantrymen who die. The trigger pullers, right? The trigger pullers usually die, the infantrymen. But most of the killing is done by artillery. It's all that shrapnel that's in the air, right? All that iron. It's just horrible, right? Well, that's point number one. Point number two is that you care about the balance of manpower on each side. You care about the population size of the two countries, because the population size of the two countries tells you a lot about how big an army you can raise. By my calculations, the Russians have an advantage in manpower of 5-1. 5-1. The Russians have a 5-1 advantage in manpower. And in artillery, over time, sometimes people will say it's 5-1, 5-1. Sometimes they'll say it's 7-1. And many times people will say the Russians have a 10-1 advantage in artillery. So if you have two armies standing toe-to-toe trying to bleed each other white, and one army has 5 times as many people, and that same army has 5, 7, 10 times as much artillery, and artillery is killing 80% of the infantry on each side, it's pretty clear it's going to win. And that's the Russians. And that's exactly what's happening. To make matters worse, in the beginning, there was a situation where neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians controlled the skies. And the Russians had a bigger air force, but the problem is the Ukrainians had a lot of air defense systems down on the ground that could shoot the Russian airplanes out of the sky. Okay? What's happened over time are two developments. Number one, the Russians basically destroyed all those ground-based air defense assets. So they can now fly over the battlefield. The Russian Air Force can. Secondly, the Russians had thousands and thousands and thousands of dumb bombs. These are bombs that, you throw them out of the airplane and you're never too sure where they're going to hit. What they did was they came up with guidance kits. They came up with guidance kits that they put on each of these dumb bombs and turned them into smart bombs. So they basically can take these smart bombs, and remember there are thousands of them, and they can put them in the pickle barrel. That's how accurate they are. So not only do the Russians have this massive advantage in firepower, right? They also have firepower on the ground. They have a massive advantage in firepower in the air. And they have an advantage in manpower. So the end result is the Ukrainians are going to lose. And if you read the papers carefully, the Ukrainians are losing. And the West and the Ukrainians themselves are now coming to the realization that this is the case. So the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're not going to conquer all of Ukraine. First of all, they don't have the military capability. Secondly, they'd be crazy to try and conquer the western half of Ukraine, because the western half of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate the Russians, and it would result in a massive insurgency that the Russians don't need. So what's going to happen is the Russians are going to end up conquering somewhere between 20% and 40% of Ukraine. They now control about 20% of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine. If they can, I believe they'll take up to 40%. And furthermore, they will go to great lengths, the Russians will, to make sure that Ukraine itself is a dysfunctional rogue state. They do not want a Ukraine that is a vibrant state, because that Ukraine will then become part of NATO. They want a dysfunctional rogue state that's not well equipped to become either a part of NATO or a part of the EU. This is a way of saying the Russians are going to go to great lengths over time to wreck Ukraine and keep Ukraine wrecked. And they're going to end up taking a large slice of Ukrainian territory and incorporating it into Russia. And you're going to get a frozen conflict. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. Anybody who reads any stories about meaningful peace agreements in Ukraine, you should dismiss that. That's not happening. You're going to get a frozen conflict. It's going to be analogous to what you have on the 38th parallel between the two Koreas. That's where we're headed. Now, just to take it one step further, the problem that we face here is that the Russians, right? The Russians are going to be deeply opposed for the foreseeable future to the Ukrainians and to the West. And the Ukrainians in the West are going to be deeply opposed to the Russians. These countries are going to be adversaries for the long term. This is not going to be a peaceful Eastern Europe. And the United States and the Ukrainians are going to go to great lengths to undermine Russia's control of the areas of Ukraine that it annexes. The United States and Ukraine and the Europeans are going to go to great lengths to cause trouble on the Russian home front. And the Russians, for their part, are going to go to great lengths, as I told you, to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rogue state. The Russians are going to go to great lengths to sow dissension, create trouble in Europe, and they're going to go to great lengths to create trouble between the United States and its European allies. The Russians are going to try to undermine transatlantic relations. We're going to have poisonous relations between the West and Ukraine on one side and the Russians on the other side. That means the United States is going to be deeply involved in Eastern Europe for a long time to come. One final point. There are 5 potential flashpoints in East Asia, in Eastern Europe, involving Ukraine, where you could have that frozen conflict that I described turn into a hot conflict. One is conflict over the Black Sea. 2 is conflict over Moldova. 3 is conflict over Belarus. 4 is conflict over the Baltic Sea / Kaliningrad. And 5 is conflict in the Arctic. You all know there are 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic. 7 of them are NATO countries. 7 of them. Only 1 isn't, and that's, of course, Russia. And this is why Russia has now welcomed the Chinese to get involved with Russia up in the Arctic, because the Russians are outnumbered up there. That's going to be a dangerous area up there. The Baltic's going to be a dangerous area. Belarus, what happens when Lukashenko goes? The United States will probably try to foster a color revolution in Belarus. That's going to work really well. That's going to work really well. It's going to lead to no end of trouble. So what I'm telling you folks is, we are pinned down for the long term in Ukraine. We made a catastrophic mistake in April of 2008 in pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO. And then we doubled down whenever we had an opportunity to back off and accept the fact that the Russians would not tolerate Ukraine and NATO. We continued to double down because we thought the Russians were weak. We thought we could shove NATO expansion down their throat. We were wrong, and the end result is we are in a conflict situation that shows no signs of ending anytime soon. And again, there are two consequences for us which matter greatly for you. You want to think about this. Number one, we're pinned down in Eastern Europe and we can't fully pivot. And number two, we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Every time you hear me say that Russian-U.S. relations, U.S.-Russian relations are poisonous, that's good news for you. That's good news for you. Because you want the Russians on your side of the ledger, not on our side of the ledger. Then we go to the Middle East. Different set of circumstances, but the same end result. We are pinned down there and we're not getting out. First of all, you want to just remember that the United States has a special relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. And we're very clear on that. The U.S. relationship with Israel has no parallel in recorded history. The United States, despite the fact it is far more powerful than Israel, gives Israel unconditional support. Virtually everything that Israel does, the United States supports no matter what. And if the United States is unhappy with a particular policy that Israel is pursuing, it's almost impossible for us to change Israeli thinking on that particular issue. It's really an amazing situation. And of course, this is because of the Israel lobby, which is a remarkably powerful interest group in the United States that pushes American policymakers. And here we're talking about American presidents and politicians on Capitol Hill to support Israel unconditionally. And we basically do that. And why am I telling you this? Because the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. And when we talk about Israel being involved in this conflict or Israel being in that conflict, we might as well say Israel and the United States. You all understand that. And we'll talk about Iran in a minute. That's what's going on here. Okay. So, the question you want to ask yourself is Israel, which is now involved in these three big conflicts, one with Hamas, and the Palestinians more generally, two with Hezbollah, and three with Iran. Is Israel going to win these conflicts and put an end to them so that the United States and Israel can get out of the mess that we now see? The answer is almost certainly no. These problems are not going to get any better. If anything, they're going to get worse. The Israelis are in a hole and they're just digging deeper and deeper, in case you hadn't noticed. And the United States is down in the hole with them with a big shovel. And the two of them are just digging deeper and deeper. And what exactly is going on here? First, let's talk about Hamas. Then we'll talk about Hezbollah. Then we'll talk about Iran. On Hamas, Israel today is generally referred to as Greater Israel. And Greater Israel has three parts. One is the country that was created in 1948 and existed until 1967. We call that Green Line Israel. Then in 1967, the Israelis won a series of spectacular victories in a war, the 67 war. 6-day war, it's sometimes called, where they acquired the West Bank and Gaza. And today, the Israelis control the West Bank and Gaza, And it's the West Bank and Gaza, plus what I call Green Line Israel, Israel that was created in 1948. Those three areas, they comprise Greater Israel. And Greater Israel has an equal number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews inside its borders. It's very important to understand that. Greater Israel has an equal number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews, about 7.3 million of each, okay? And is the leading human rights group in Israel. All three of these human rights groups have written lengthy, detailed, sophisticated reports explaining why Israel is an apartheid state. Well, the victims, the dominated people, the people who were dominated in this apartheid state are the Palestinians. And what the Palestinians did on October 7th, the Palestinians who are in Gaza, who live in an open-air prison, broke out. That's what happened. It was a prison break. And it was not the first time the Palestinians resisted Israeli brutal policies. You had a first intifada in 1987, you had a second intifada in 2000, and then you had what happened on October 7th. And this is what happens when you have an apartheid state, because the victims are going to fight back. And we all agree, right? We all agree that the only way you're going to solve this problem is to give the Palestinians a state of their own. You can continue this apartheid state and the Palestinian problem is going to go away is delusional. The Israelis have a slightly different view. Their view is, we agree with the claim that you can't maintain an apartheid state in the long term. So the solution is to either murder all the Palestinians or drive them out. What the Israelis are interested in doing in Gaza today is ethnically cleansing Gaza. And they'd like to ethnically cleanse the West Bank as well. They'd like to drive the Palestinians out and create what's basically a homogeneous Jewish state. That's the basic goal here. But they've been unable to do that. They've been unable to do that. The Israelis, as you well know, went into Gaza and said they were going to defeat Hamas decisively and they were going to get their hostages back. They have not defeated Hamas decisively. And if they defeated Hamas decisively, another group would appear to replace Hamas. As long as the Palestinians are living in an apartheid state, they are going to resist. And that's what you got on October 7th. It was resistance against apartheid. It was resistance against living in an open-air prison. And unless you kill all the Palestinians, or unless you drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, this problem is going to persist for the foreseeable future. What I point to you about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and you're focusing today mainly on Hamas and on Gaza, is this problem is not going away. It's just not going away. Israel has not solved the problem. Then there's Hezbollah. You know, Hezbollah is in Lebanon, southern Lebanon. And after October 7th, shortly after October 7th, Hezbollah began firing rockets and missiles into northern Israel in support of Hamas. That's why the war between Hezbollah and Iran started. The Israelis, right? The Israelis went to war in Gaza, and Hezbollah went to war against Israel. Hezbollah says, we will stop firing rockets and missiles into Israel when the war in Gaza stops. The Israelis say, we're not stopping the war in Gaza. Hezbollah says, we will therefore continue to dump missiles on northern Israel. one of the real problems the Israelis face is that 60,000 Israeli citizens who live in the north have had to flee their homes and take temporary refuge in the center of Israel. And the Israelis want to move those people back, but they can't move them back because the rocket fire and the missile fire continues. So the question is, what can Israel do to defeat Hezbollah? Well, they've killed Nasrallah. They've killed a number of other leaders of Hezbollah. And you know what happened? They bring in new leaders. Just bring in new leaders. Decapitation doesn't work as a strategy. Furthermore, they're bombing southern Beirut, where the Shia live, killing a huge number of civilians. That's not going to work either. We have a rich history of bombing campaigns that are designed to kill significant numbers of civilians. We bombed Japan in World War II. We bombed Germany in World War II. And it did not force those people to quit. Right? So you're not going to force them to quit. Not surprisingly, the Israelis have just invaded southern Lebanon. You know, they've invaded southern Lebanon now. You really think Israelis who couldn't defeat Hamas are going to defeat Hezbollah, who are better armed and occupying much more treacherous terrain, right, for the Israelis? I don't think so. Hezbollah is not going away. And they've got all those rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. So they've not defeated Hamas. They've not defeated Hezbollah. And then there's the third crisis, which is Iran. And this is a really dangerous one. Say a few words about this. Iran does not want a war with Israel and does not want a war with the United States. The United States does not want a war with Iran. Just think about that. We do. It's very clear. We do not want a war with Iran. They do not want a war with us or with Israel. Well, what's going on here? Guess what? The Israelis have dragged us in to the present situation where we're going to have, we've already had a shooting match involving Iran and the United States. You all understand that? On April 14th, the United States and Iran fought against each other. This is when Iran launched its first volley of missiles and drones at Israel, April 14th. The United States helped Israel knock down a lot of those drones and missiles. And what's happened now is the Israelis have provoked the Iranians into attacking again, which they did on October 1st. And now the Israelis are getting, and by the way, when the Iranians attacked on October 1st, we played a key role in shooting down some of those Iranian missiles. So we, the United States, have already fought against the Iranians 2 times, April 14th and October 1st. And now the Israelis are getting ready to launch a massive strike against Iran. And the Iranians have said, and I don't blame them one bit, the Iranians have said, you hit us, we want you to understand we have lots of missiles ready and raring to go, and we're going to retaliate against you. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what targets are the what targets are the Israelis going to hit in the next few days or weeks, whenever they attack? Are they going to go after Iran's nuclear facilities? Oh boy. Joe Biden has said, I, under no circumstances, want them to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. The Israelis are going to laugh at what he thinks. They don't care what he thinks. They'll do what they think. It's the way it works. That's the power of the lobby. And then there's the possibility to go after Iranian oil fields and oil refineries to cripple the Iranian economy. And there's all sorts of reasons to think that if they do that, the Iranians are going to shut down the Persian Gulf, the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, and they'll work with the Houthis to shut down the flow of oil out of the Red Sea, and they'll go to great lengths to do damage to to the flow of oil around the world, which will have huge negative consequences for the international economy. You get lots of your oil from Iran, by the way, and you're heavily dependent on exports of oil into China. It's not be good for you. It will not be good for us. This is where we're possibly headed. The Israelis, again, are going to really slam Iran. It's just a matter of time. You all understand it. You want to be reading the newspapers and thinking about this. And you want to think about what's going to happen when the Israelis slam Iran, and then what the Iranians are going to do. And by the way, when the Iranians hit back at Israel, Israel is going to counterattack. And then the Iranians are going to counterattack. Right? You're going up the escalation ladder here. Where does this end? What's the happy ending? Does anybody have a happy ending? The Israelis talk about knocking out the Iranian nuclear capability once and for all. This is a joke. You're not going to knock that nuclear capability out once and for all. You know the United States, we had nuclear weapons first, 1945. Soviets tested a weapon in 1949. We thought about going in and striking the Soviet nuclear capability, killing the baby in the cradle. Killing the baby in the cradle. And by the way, we, the Americans, and the Soviets thought about doing the same thing with Chinese nuclear capability. When you first developed nuclear weapons, we thought about going in and destroying your nascent capability. We didn't do it against the Soviets, and we didn't do it against the Chinese, and the Soviets didn't do it against the Chinese for one very good reason. We understood that we could do enormous damage on a first strike, but in the Soviet case, they would eventually build nuclear weapons in secret and have a nuclear capability. And with regard to China, you would do the same thing. And this is what is going to happen with Iran. If they take out Iran's nuclear capability, and remember, Iran does not have nuclear weapons yet, it's close, but they've not decided to cross the threshold. But they'll just rebuild those facilities, and they'll get nuclear weapons, and they'll be mad as hornets. Is this a good situation? I don't think so. Anyway, where are we in the Middle East? It is really hard to tell a happy story here. Hamas, the Palestinians, the situation is a disaster. There's no end in sight. And from a moral point of view, you all understand that Israel's committing genocide. It's executing a genocide in Gaza. It's not politically correct to say this in the West. And I'm one of the few Americans who will say that. The United States is complicit in the genocide. This is a moral stain on our reputation. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And it is certainly a moral stain on Israel's reputation. This is a genocide. And it's ongoing as I'm up here talking. And the Israelis have zero interest in a two-state solution. So it looks like Israel's going to remain an apartheid state, unless they murder all the Palestinians or drive them out. It's a disaster. Hezbollah is not going away. These are really tough fighters. The Israelis invaded Lebanon twice before, and it ended up a disaster. It's not going to have a happy ending this time. With regard to the Iran situation, I mean, I don't see how the present crisis is resolved peacefully, the present crisis. But just take this out over the long term. This one's not going away either. And given the fact, as I told you before, that the United States and Israel are joined at the hip, the fact that the Israelis are in deep, deep trouble in the Middle East means that we, too, are in deep, deep trouble in the Middle East. And we have all these military assets that are deployed in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, and so forth and so on. It should otherwise be in East Asia, containing China. But they're not. So, let me just conclude by repeating my bottom line. My bottom line is that it is in America's interest to contain China. Not to fight a war with China. We do not want a war. You don't want a war, we don't want a war. We're going to get an intense security competition. There are going to be crises. This is not good news, but those crises can be managed. But the point is, the United States should be concentrating on containing China, number one. And number two, it is doing a half-baked job of containing China, because number one, it's bogged down in Ukraine. Number two, it's bogged down in the Middle East. Number three, there's no sign that we're going to get out of either one of those places anytime soon. And fourth, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So, the United States has some serious problems. This is really bad news for me and my fellow countrymen, but this is good news for you.
Okay, 45 minutes left, and I have a small suggestions to the first nine of our colleagues. Because we have dinner today, I invite you to attend the dinner talk. So if you can join, leave the opportunity to our students. If you cannot attend the dinner talk, you can ask and call. 能参加吗？如果你参加不了，参加 OK, you first. Professor. Comments and yes. Yes. Okay. 把今天帮我讲一下麦。
Okay. Good afternoon, Professor Nijan. It's the third time I met you in this conference. It's very a pleasure to make some comments and to ask you a question. So, you just said that three regions, especially East Asia, Europe, and Middle East, matters really for America. But you didn't mention two continents that are rising currently, that is Africa and Latin America. While Latin America used to be your backyard, now China is the biggest trading partner of Latin America. And Africa is rising with an average GDP rate about 5% in the last 10 years. So it's a future of future international investments. So why do you still think that China is destined to become a regional hegemon in East Asia, while China has a broad interest in Africa or in Latin America? So China cannot afford not to rival with Japan in a narrow region in this East Asia, but to expand its interest in Africa and Latin America.
Can people hear me in the back if I talk like this?
Yeah, of course.
Better use that. Thank you. This is a very interesting set of questions. One point that I didn't make because of time considerations, and I really talked much longer than I realized, but my argument is that China will want to become a regional hegemon. You heard that already. The other thing that China will do, and is doing, is it will develop power projection capability so that it can project power all around the world, just like the United States does. You are building a blue water navy. You are building aircraft carriers. I'm shocked. I'm shocked. China is interested in power projection, right? So you see China projecting power into the Gulf, not much yet, it's early, into the Persian Gulf, into Africa, into Latin America. That's your point, okay? Now, with regard to the Persian Gulf, I believe that you, China, and us, the United States, are going to end up competing in serious ways in the Persian Gulf. Okay? That's inevitable. And I believe the principal reason that you're building a blue water navy is to protect your sea lines of communication between the Gulf and between East Asia. Okay? Now I want to make one additional point about how we have screwed up to your advantage. And that is by supporting Israel in its genocide in Gaza and supporting Israel in its murderous policies against the Lebanese, and in supporting Israel in its policies towards Iran, we have angered the Saudis and the Gulf states, and of course the Iranians, and that plays to your advantage. In other words, China can take advantage of America's eroding position in the Middle East to improve its diplomatic position, which is what you want to do. You want to be deeply involved in the Persian Gulf, you want to have lots of influence, and you want to have military capabilities, power projection capabilities from East Asia to the Gulf. And that's going to happen. But those were not the two examples you raised. The professor raised two other issues. One was Africa, and the other is Latin America, okay? And remember what I said, as you edge towards becoming a regional hegemon. China's not a regional hegemon, but my argument is it's pushing in that direction. Remember what I said about freedom to roam? Freedom to roam? You remember that argument about the United States freedom to roam? What he's describing, this is freedom to roam, right? Freedom to roam. China's building power projection capability. Again, I don't blame the Chinese one bit, but as an American, I don't want to see it happen. But anyway, be that as it may. Let's talk about Africa and let's talk about Latin America. Africa is an interesting case. It's not a strategically important region of the world. Remember what I said to you, there are three areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere that matter to the United States. One is Europe, two is East Asia, and three is the Gulf. Not Africa. Because Africa has no great powers, and it has some oil, but it's not where most of the oil is. So Africa is not strategically important. Sometimes when I say this, if there are Africans in the audience, they come up to me afterwards, and I think that they're hurt that I said that Africa is not important. And I always say to them, I'm just arguing that it's not strategically important. That's my only point. And secondly, I always tell Africans they should be happy. They should be happy that it's not a strategically important area. Because the United States gets interested in Africa, there's no limit to how much trouble it will cause. So be happy that you're not a strategically important area. But it's not a strategically important area. The United States, I believe, will not seriously contest China in Africa. There'll be some contestation, but not much. Latin America is a completely different story. You can have good economic relations with the countries in Latin America, but you cannot have military relations. You cannot build a base, right? You cannot build a base in Cuba. You cannot You all want to think about this because it is clear, as the professor said, that what's happening here is that China is developing actually quite close economic relations with a number of countries in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States is a bit worried about that, but not too worried. But economic relations is one thing. Military or diplomatic relations is another. And this gets to this is what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. The Monroe Doctrine says no distant great power, in this case China, can put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard. And my argument to you, as Chinese, is that you should have a Monroe Doctrine. You should not want the Americans running ships and aircraft up and down your coastline. You should not want American ground forces in Japan and Okinawa, in South Korea. Right? You shouldn't want that, but we should want it. fortunately, from our point of view, we're already there. Right? But unfortunately, from China's point of view, you're not already there. And if you start to come into the Western Hemisphere, the United States will contest you. So I think what I tried to do here was talk just about power projection capability. You want to focus on that? And then I talked about the Gulf, where I think the real competition will take place, because that's where the oil is. Africa, not strategically important to either country. And Latin America, strategically important to us, and therefore China should be there.
Hey, Professor Su Hao, yeah, please.
Hi, John. This is my name.
Yes, good to
I'm
see
not
you.
sure what about you still remember my name.
I do. I remember everybody's name.
Well, okay. I was with you for 132 years. I remember when we met with others
Yes.
in Austin. We attended the same conference.
Yes.
32 years ago. I wrote an article when I interviewed with you and introduced your point of view in China, and since then, your name becomes well knowledge in China. So I have two questions maybe that are related with each other. The first, we know that 2002, British senior advisor to Tony Blair wrote an article to define United States as a new imperialism. Right? So it seems to me that many American scholars and even politicians enjoy this kind of definition of new imperialism, that is the United States. So my question to you is that, when we're thinking about imperialism, we remind us that the Roman Empire, British Empire, or there's the logic of empire, so-called like Caesars. The Roman Empire say that I came, I found, and I conquered. So my question to you, first question then, how about the Americans now? Your understanding of the Americans' behavior is following such kind of Western empire logic? On our first question. And the second, regarding China, traditionally, Western scholars define China as an empire since ancient time. Now, something about the current Chinese behavior seems to them that it also follows the logic of empire logic, same as the United States. So my question to you, the second is that, what do you think about Chinese behavior? Is following the same logic of empire or something else, based upon the Western civilization logic? Thank you.
This is a great question, and very important to understand that my whole edifice, my whole framework, my whole argument is about great power politics. And I actually have no interest in thinking about empire. I think that anybody who thinks about empire in the modern world is going to get themselves into really big trouble. You all remember from your history books, there was the British Empire, there was the French Empire, there was the Belgian Empire, there was the Spanish Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was the Ottoman Empire. You all remember those from the history books? You know where they are now? Down in the toilet bowl. They're all gone. You go to your travel agent and say, I want to go to the Ottoman Empire. Gone. The British Empire? Gone. The French Empire? Gone. You know why? In good part because of nationalism. Nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. And people who live in those empires don't like them at all. If you're in Africa, you don't want the British telling you what kind of toilet paper you can use. You don't want them telling you what kind of political system you can have, right? This is why I opposed going into Iraq in 2003. It's why I opposed getting involved in Afghanistan after 2001 and not leaving right away. I grew up during the Vietnam War. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. I learned a number of important lessons during the Vietnam War. And one thing I learned was stay out of Vietnam. The French told us, Charles de Gaulle told us, in 1965 when we were thinking about going into Vietnam. We've been there, we did that, and it did not work out very well. We didn't listen, we went in, it didn't work out very well. We were not fighting communism in Vietnam, we were fighting Vietnamese nationalism. Right? And by the way, the Chinese foolishly went into Vietnam in 1979, and the same thing happened to them that happened to us, that happened to the French. Right? So my argument is, not only do you not want to establish an empire, what you want to hope for is that your adversary tries to establish an empire, because it's guaranteed to fail. The story I like to tell is 1979. Soviets invade Afghanistan. 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. You're all too young to remember. Anyway, everybody in the West was aghast. This is the end of the world. The Soviets are on the march. They're going to create an empire. Oh my God, what are we going to do? I said, you've got it completely wrong. This is the most wonderful thing that could have happened to us. They just jumped into a quagmire. If the Chinese you want to invade Afghanistan, good luck. The British tried it, we tried it. Right? You want an empire? No. If you're Chinese and you're smart, what you want to do is you want to grow your economy. That's the most important thing. You want to develop all these sophisticated technologies. You want to do everything you can to beat the Americans in terms of the race that's now taking place in terms of cutting-edge technology. That's what you want to do, right? And you don't want to fight wars if you don't have, if you can avoid it. And you certainly don't want to conquer other countries. This is why, by the way, I told you, Putin will not try to conquer all of Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine has a lot of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in the East who don't mind or want to be part of Russia. But the further west he goes in Ukraine, right, the further west he goes, the more ethnic Ukrainians he runs into. Nationalism, nationalism, nationalism. One more story. Very important here. I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but these are excellent questions. And I think these arguments are ones that you guys want to think long and hard about. During the Cold War, the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe. It was a nightmare. In 1953, they had a revolt in East Germany. In 1956, they had to go into Hungary. In 1968, they had to go into Czechoslovakia. They almost went into Poland 3 separate times because the Poles were so difficult to deal with. Polish nationalism. And this doesn't even take into account the Albanians and the Romanians. Oh my God, people in Moscow, the last thing they wanted to do was have to deal with them. That was the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. You think the Soviets, or now the Russians, want to go back into Eastern Europe? Been there, done that, and it did not work out very well. So my view as an American is no empire, and let's hope the Chinese decide that they're going to build an empire. Your view should be no empire for us. All we want to do is grow our economy, become as powerful as possible, develop powerful military forces to protect ourselves, and hope the Americans go back into Iraq, go back into Afghanistan. It took us 20 years to get out of Afghanistan. And we have all these people in the United States who are saying, this is a disaster, we should stay. Did any of those people have a plan for how we could win the war in Afghanistan? No. any more than anybody had a plan for how we could win the war in Vietnam. I told you I was in the American military for the 10 years that the Vietnam War went on, 65 to 75. And we spent endless hours talking about how the United States could pacify Vietnam, how we could win in Vietnam. And eventually, people with a triple-digit IQ figured out we could not win in Vietnam. It wasn't because we were dealing with communists, it was because we were dealing with Vietnamese nationalism.
I invite you to attend the dinner, okay? I hope to give more opportunity to our students. Collect 3 questions together and then answer together, okay? Collect 3. Okay. 3 questions.
But ask everybody to only ask one question. The problem is you ask excellent questions. These are great questions. And I can't stop myself from talking. So respect the fact that I can't.
Okay, so you ask a question, you can identify yourself. Okay.
Hi, Professor. I'm a graduate student from Beijing Foreign Studies University, and my research topic is about Britain. And I want to know, how do you think of the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States? That's it. Thank you.
Hi, Professor. I'm a student in Peking University. I'm majoring in Arabic and International Relations. So I'm curious about China's participation in the Middle East, and you just mentioned that. I want to hear your arguments or opinions about what it will be like in the near future.
Nice to meet you again, Professor. I'm the PhD candidate of Peking University, and my question is... 5 years ago, I was an undergraduate student in University of So, Professor, my question is about you have just talked about the failure of the diplomatic policy of the Biden-Harris administration, and next month will be the presidential election. So, do you think the President Donald Trump, if he elected again, will be more satisfied with his foreign policy because he want to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine, and he want to contain China, especially about the economy of China? Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you for those excellent questions. I'll try to be as succinct in my answers. Just on the UK-US relationship, I think we talk a lot about the fact that we have a special relationship with Britain, and one might think it's a special relationship similar to the one we have with Israel. It's not. And you can read John Maynard Keynes on this. The United States has played hardball with Britain over time. But in recent years, we've reached a point where the British are basically our lapdogs. They'll do whatever we tell them to do. I think in general, the Europeans are like that. You all understand that at the Bucharest NATO summit, this is when that fateful decision was made in April of 2008 to expand NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia. Angela Merkel, who was then the Chancellor of Germany, and Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the president in France, both Sarkozy and Merkel were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO because they understood what the consequences would be. But in typical European fashion, they caved into the United States, and they went along with this cockamamie idea that produced a disaster. And I would argue the British are like the other European countries, and one could argue they're even worse. They do America's bidding. They do what the United States wants. So you have this very special relationship, but it's not because of a lobby. It's because they're weak And they think that the United States is this very intelligent, great power that can do good by them, when in fact the exact opposite is the case. With regard to China's position in the Middle East, or the Persian Gulf, look, huge amounts of oil comes out of the Gulf. China gets lots of oil from the Gulf. I would estimate over 25% of China's oil comes from the Gulf. I think China has a deep-seated interest in having significant political and military influence in the Gulf. It's developing power projection capability, that makes sense. And furthermore, it is facing a diplomatic constellation that presents lots of opportunities for China to form good relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and the Gulf states and other countries as well, for the purpose of enhancing China's position. One point I didn't make in my talk that you want to think about is that as a result of America's policies in the Gulf and in Ukraine, what we've done is we've driven the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians close together. Those four countries. And this means that China and Russia are going to have good relations with Iran. The Russians, you want to pay attention to this, you want to read every day what the Russians and the Iranians are doing to get ready for the Israeli attack. The Russians are helping the Iranians, right? So the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, they're all been pushed close together. And the end result, again, as I said, is China has a wonderful opportunity to have good relations with Iran, and it's the Russians who are doing the dirty work there. So you can sit behind and let the Russians do the dirty work with the Iranians. And you can have good relations with the Saudis and the Gulf states. And at the same time, you want to build power projection capability. I don't want you to build power projection capability, but you should build power projection capability. Trump versus Harris. I would make the general point that one thing I like about Trump, I'm not a Trump supporter or I'm a Harris. One thing I do like about Trump is he's not a warmonger. Biden is a warmonger, Harris is a warmonger, right? And these people have never seen a war they didn't want to fight. Trump is actually not a warmonger. In my opinion. But let's talk about what difference Trump will make versus Harris will make if one or the other is elected. I think in terms of U.S. policy in the Middle East, because of what I said about the lobby, it doesn't matter whether Trump or Harris get elected, right? They'll both support Israel unconditionally, because in the United States of America, you have no choice. With regard to China, I don't think it matters whether Trump gets back in the White House or Harris gets elected. We will continue to pursue containment towards China. There may be some differences on the margin in the policy that they pursue. The place where it might make a difference, Trump thinks it's the place where it will make a difference, is on Ukraine and Russia. It's quite clear that Trump has no use for Zelensky. He wants to end the Ukraine war. Trump wants to have good relations with the Russians, and he wants to have good relations with Vladimir Putin. Harris wants more of the same. Harris wants to continue the Biden policy of supporting Ukraine and continuing the war and fighting to the last Ukrainian. That's Harris's view. So they have different views. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you think that Trump will be able to get his way? Remember, when Trump took over in January 2017, he was determined to have good relations with Putin and good relations with Russia, and he failed. By his own admission, he failed. He says, this time it's going to be different. This time I'm going to get my way with regard to Russia, Ukraine, and you have to just ask yourself, who would you bet on winning, Trump or the deep state? And I'll bet on the deep state.
好啦，终于啊，等到我整体这个1个多小时啊，看完很不容易。能看到这儿的都是咱们的铁杆粉丝。首先我要说，他说了几个论点，美国和中国的冲突是不可化解的。这个其实我发现啊，他的基础论调和论点，它不存在于一些阴谋诡计，它就是在说大家在明面上的一些反应，和如果你继续需要维持下去的话，那么你一定要保持哪些基本的原则，有哪些步骤是不得不去做的。身为一个大国，你要做一个大国应该做的事情，如果不这样去做的话，那么你会受到很大的利益威胁和危害。所以他说美国和中国的冲突不可化解，这个就是一个假论。这个假定呢，其实和中国的这种中式思想差不多。大家如果去看的话，你身边一群所谓的生意人呐，或者是从政人士啊，他们一般是很冷酷的，针对任何的问题不以情感和情绪来说事，他们只讨论放在桌面上的东西，而且呢能给每个人都能给一套完整的解答思路。所以说这种呢讨论方式就是一种大国风范的讨论方式，他不在乎所谓蝇营狗苟的，所谓桌下交易的一些不能出面子上的东西，他只考虑这个人你从小长到大你必须要经历的思路是什么，所以这种正确率概率很高啊。另外他也说了，特殊情况他举了一个非常有意思的例子，我不知道大家看出来没有，为什么他一直在说美国和以色列的关系，就是美国对于以色列的无条件支持，以及以色列的人呢对美国总统的建议一种无视，就是因为他认为这是属于一个中间变量出现的。美国因为它的社会结构呢是财阀结构的，是有说客的，那它的这种服务的这个有所谓的说客或者有财阀，影响了美国政治的格局和走向，所以美国会做出来一些不符合大国形势的一些东西。你比如说针对以色列呀，他对于以色列的帮助是超过了国家和国家之间的一些权力纷争的，甚至是不计代价的去扶持的。为什么会出现这种情况呢？就是因为以色列的利益和美国部分财阀的利益勾结在一起。那你说美国它是不是就有一个弱点或者说一个弊端呢？其实他过来中国在讲述东西的时候他是比较全面的，他已经告诉你了针对美国这样的情况可能会出现什么样的问题，那么我们针对这些问题如何去看待美国，美国针对这些特殊情况是怎么去解决的。那像这种就是属于一种丛林法则了。你比如说他认为所有的强国策略大国策略都是遵从于丛林法则在走的，只是以色列的方向呢有点类似于美国助推的背后的一个推手一样。那他一直认为的是，不管是中国还是美国，不能去主动的去招惹别人，要保持一个健康稳定的良性发展。你说不招惹别人，不要木秀于林啊，那么就能得到一个安稳的发展。他是在之前的这个视频中也说过，中国最好的方式就是稳定下来，自己发展自己的经济，自己发展自己的尖端科技，才能在安全竞争的这种零和博弈下取得一个可能性的胜利。对于现在来说的话，中国还是太弱啊，还是有很多方面比不上美国。我们只能是一步一个脚印慢慢去走。你毕竟曾经世界上发生过4次挑战美国权威的事情都失败了全部都失败了。那中国是不是真的能崛起，这个我们要看。另外呢，就是大家一直在说帝国的问题，我们要注意米尔斯海默说的是大国所要面临的情况。如果是帝国的话，他说大家都不希望自己当帝国你自己当帝国的话是有害的，希望对方去宣扬帝国。那他去宣扬帝国，在这种意识形态上大家就不认可，那全世界就会去围攻他。这是现在的一个情况。美国也现在正在出现这种问题，他所宣传的意识形态和宣传出来让各国听到的东西都似乎是一种比较帝国意识的，都是有点美帝倾向的。那像这种的话，有可能在后期会迎来一些 比较不好的范式。但是我非常认可它，就是因为它其实这种核心逻辑和中国的这种现实主义色彩的，尤其是以悲观主义色彩来看待现实问题的，是非常一致的。比如说我们在和人交朋友的时候，一定是假设这个人是处在什么环境，如果我是他的话，我一定下一步会去做什么。那做什么就是他的利益，他不背弃他的利益，说明他是一个正常人。如果他一直背弃自己的利益，说明他的利益没有被伤害到底。尤其这2年经济下行，大家会看到身边的人呢，如果你的利益被威胁、被压抑的过狠，人就不要脸了，人就说什么话、做什么事情就变得没有伪装，相当于直接撕破脸了。大国和大国之间的利益更是这样，大国和大国之间没有面子在，没有所谓的像人这样子这么情绪化的东西在，它是一个非常死板的帝国机器。那它需要更多的东西，就是更多的利益，对不对？然后就是更多的信用，在特定情况下，信用可以抛弃，但是利益不能抛弃。所以这就是美国现在正在进行的。如果真的让它真的做到了美元霸权的3.0，也就是稳定币配合美元的这种搭配结合的话，那么美国不仅能收割明面上的钱，也能收割暗地里的钱，世界将会变得更乱。这也是下一步的情况。因为美帝发现了一个问题，就是现在各个国家的经济发展，尤其是科技力量都在晋升上来之后，已经不足以满足美国所有这些人的衣食住行了。其实大家如果知道的话，从09年、从10年开始，美国的风光就已经不在了，一直在走下坡路。它就是因为这种虚拟经济啊，这种以经济来赚钱的方式，金融啊，以金融去获利的方式呢，钱太好赚了，那它就变成了1/1000的人能把其他9999个人的钱全部给它收割掉，这就变成了一个极端化的、一个恐怖的金融法西斯主义的一个侵略环境。所以为什么说美国呢是有点带有这种意识形态法西斯和金融法西斯的？所以我带着我国家的这种意识形态呢，去影响你的国家，帮你国家去改造。你一改造就发现了，完了，因为人家美国是第一个做的，所以呢，人家能做成。但是别的国家、第三世界的国家，如果按照这种形态做，必死。为什么？你在人家的规则里边去希望让自己生活得更好，那美帝一定会把你洗得干干净净。日本为什么现在变成这个样子？他要做写报做的时间太久了，所以他必须要把国债顶得高高的，对不对？然后阻止你美国继续过来吸我们的血。你说日本能够有一个所谓20年的辉煌吗？他即便年轻人现在起来了，他要找寻他新的方法，只能让日本变得更加的极端，更加的民粹，更加的找寻一些不可能的出路。因为日本是一个小国，而中国又太强大了，所以地域矛盾是非常重要的。美国在这个美洲版图上，它不管是在南美还是在北美，它是没有对手的，这个很重要很重要。中国四处遍地都是对手，这也是美国培养起来的。韩国、日本，对不对？印度啊，你这些都是，哪怕菲律宾，它都是会影响中国的，甚至北边还有一个俄罗斯。那这种版图上接壤的这种情况，就导致一个国家非常难以去扩大和壮大。你想日本那个时候，他去侵略中国，希望得到是什么？就是你中国不要太强呀，要不然我直接吃下来一疙瘩多好呢。就是因为他的国家太小，没有办法去一口吃下中国，所以导致它的发展一下停止了。现在等于说就僵死在那儿。你说一个小虫子怎么可能吃下这么大一个版图，对不对？那今天也是说这么多啊。我认为米尔斯海默的整体经济论调和我们国内现在正在做的一些事情是相关的。美帝亡我之心是不是一直都在？而且呢，只会越来越强盛。现在好像变成了一种你死我亡，不是你死就是我亡的这样的一个境地里边去。大家呢在这种情况下，在饿虎夺食的这种情况下，自己也要学习这种国际生态上的相互的这种关系，你要加深才能去在这种当下的环境去做到那1/1000的人，才有可能去赚别人的钱。要不然的话，大家为什么说机会越来越少？就是因为财富积累越来越极端化，你自己也需要越来越聪明。现在大部分人都是聪明人，但是你不够聪明不够狠，那就只能被别人来洗。好的，那这一期呢也就到这里我们下期会继续来讲一些这种金融大家呀 对于我们生活上的、对于国际形势上的一些基本分析，包括对于我们生活环境的一些基础分析。就像我们每个人也一样，保护好自己的金融资本，然后找到自己所谓的能够实现生产力的科技材料。你最好是在尖端科技上有一些个人方面的发挥，或者家族上面有尖端科技上的发挥，那可以保证你最起码在10到20年之内能吃饱饭，能饿不死。剩下来的话，你可能就需要靠国家呀、靠政策呀给你一些帮助了。那好，那这一期就这样，我们下期再见。我是不错，大家拜拜。